Usually when we think about a resume, the strategy is pretty straightforward, right? You put your most marketable, like undeniably impressive skill right at the very top in bold font so nobody misses it.
Right, yeah. It's just basic self-promotion. You lead with the thing you were actually famous for.
Exactly. But imagine a job pitch where the applicant spends, 10 full paragraphs aggressively selling his ability to build portable bridges, design armored vehicles, construct cannons, and divert entire waterways.
It's quite the list.
It is. He paints this picture of himself as the ultimate military mastermind. And then finally, buried way down in the 11th paragraph, almost as like a casual afterthought, he adds, oh, and by the way, I can also paint. I can do everything possible in painting.
It really reads like a wildly confident defense contractor who, thinks he might also dabble in watercolors on the weekend.
Right. But that job pitch was actually written by the man who would go on to create the two most famous paintings in human history, the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. So today we're taking a deep dive into an incredible stack of sources, primarily a really comprehensive biography by Walter Isaacson, to figure out how the mind of Leonardo da Vinci actually worked.
Because there's this huge myth around him, right?
Yeah, exactly. We're looking past the myth of the bearded wizard to uncover how his genius wasn't some kind of supernatural gift. It was actually the result of intense observation, relentless curiosity, and his status as a complete societal misfit.
Which is fascinating, and it brings us right back to that bizarre job pitch he sent to the ruler of Milan.
The military resume.
Right, the military resume. When you look closely at that letter, which was written when Leonardo was around 30 years old, you see a really fascinating contradiction. In his own mind, he considered himself just as much a man of science and engineering as he was an artist.
But wait, if he's already a recognized, skilled painter in Florence by age 30, why hide that at the bottom of the resume? Like, was he insecure about his art, or did he genuinely value his weapon designs more?
Honestly, it was a bit of both, mixed with just a deep restlessness. He had this notorious habit of leaving painting commissions unfinished.
People hate that.
They did? It really frustrated his patrons in Florence, so he was eager for a fresh start in Milan. But the wild part is, those military engineering skills he boasted about, they existed almost entirely in his imagination.
Wait, really? He hadn't built any of them?
Nope. He hadn't actually built those armored cars or giant crossbows. He was pitching his potential. But it reveals something crucial, which is that he completely blurred the lines between disciplines. Art and science weren't separate buckets for him. They were just different tools to understand the world.
The blurring of the lines, that's what leads to those famously intense anatomy studies, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because peeling the skin off a human face just to figure out how to paint a smile, it completely shatters that modern image we have of a delicate artist sitting cleanly at an easel. It's gritty. It's almost, it's surgical.
It is entirely surgical. To get the Mona Lisa's world-famous smile right, he didn't just study faces from across a room. He went into the morgues. He was literally dissecting the flesh of cadavers to delineate the exact muscles and nerves that move the lips.
Wow, that is intense.
And when he was painting St. Jerome in the wilderness, trying to convey this profound skeletal agony, he didn't guess at the anatomy. He studied human skulls, mapping out the teeth and the bone structure in these incredibly complex, layered, three-dimensional drawings. He needed to know the underlying structure of a thing before he felt he could accurately portray its surface.
And that obsessive need to know the underlying structure of absolutely everything is captured in his notebooks. The source material notes there are over 7,200 pages of his notes and scribbles that somehow survived over the centuries.
Which is a miracle in itself.
Right, and they're written in this bizarre right-to-left mirror script, which I always assumed was a secret code to protect his ideas.
Yeah, a lot of people think that. But historians generally agree it was much more practical. Leonardo was left-handed. If you were writing with ink from left to right, your hand drags across the wet ink and smudges it.
Oh, right. So writing right to left allowed him to keep his work clean.
Exactly. But it also just speaks to the sheer unconventionality of his brain. You look at a single page of these notebooks, and it is a chaotic masterpiece. It's crammed with geometry calculations, sketches of bird wings, designs for theater props, diagrams of blood valves, and then suddenly, an angel.
The to-do lists in these notebooks are my absolute favorite part. They read like a wildly unhinged 3 a.m. internet search history.
They really do.
Like when you jump from reading a dense Wikipedia article on quantum physics to suddenly researching, the lifespan of a jellyfish. That's Leonardo's actual Tuesday. He's got entries like calculate the measurement of Milan and its suburbs, and then right below it, ask Giannino the Bombardier about how the Tower of Ferrara is walled, and then ask a Frenchman to measure the sun.
Ask a Frenchman to measure the sun. And he didn't just restrict himself to grand scientific inquiries either. He also wrote down a reminder to find a guy named Benedetto Protonari to ask him how people managed to walk on ice in Flanders.
Which is such a specific random thing to care about. Why Flanders? And why ice?
Because he was obsessed with friction and movement and how humans could overcome natural limits. If people up north had figured out how to glide across frozen water, he wanted to know the mechanics behind it. He wanted to understand the physics of the skate.
Okay, that makes sense. And then you have the pig lungs.
Ah, yes, the big lungs.
He writes down a reminder to inflate the lungs of a pig to observe whether they increase in both length and width, or only in width. It sounds bizarre, but he's essentially trying to understand the mechanics of respiration, right? Like comparing the human body to a machine, like the bellows of a forge.
Precisely. His curiosity was pure, personal, and delightfully obsessive. He didn't just want to know things so he could finish a painting or secure a job. He wanted to know them because he had a profound reverence for the wholeness of nature.
Right. And there's another incredible entry. He wrote, "Go every Saturday to the hot baths where you will see naked men." Which, okay, might be for aesthetic reasons, but it's primarily for anatomical study.
Right, he wanted to see how muscles actually stretched and strained in real life, not just on a dissection table.
But it really makes you wonder, how does a brain get wired to care about the sun's measurements, walking on ice, and pig lungs all in the same afternoon? Isaacson's biography points to a fascinating origin point, which is a massive societal disqualification right at his birth.
That's the real turning point. We have to look at April 15th, 1452. His grandfather, Antonio, recorded the birth, noting it happened at the third hour of the night. But the key factor here is who his parents were.
It's wild to think about their dynamic. His father, Ser Piero, was a very prosperous 25-year-old notary in Florence, like a guy who handled legal documents for the wealthy elite. And his mother, Caterina Lippi, was an impoverished, orphaned 16-year-old farmer from the rural Vinci area.
Right. Huge difference in status.
Yeah. Their massive class difference meant they were never going to marry. And honestly, that lack of a marriage certificate might have been the greatest thing to ever happen to human culture.
It really might have been. Because if they had married, Leonardo's entire life would have been trapped in a very specific, very boring family business.
The notary business.
Exactly. For 5 generations, the Da Vinci men had been notaries. In Renaissance Florence, notaries were the glue of the commercial class. They drafted commercial contracts, land sales, wills, and it was entirely in Latin. It was a highly respected, lucrative profession.
But definitely not creative.
Not at all. If Leonardo had been a legitimate son, that would have been his undeniable, inescapable destiny. He would have been handed a pen and told to start drafting legal jargon.
But the Venerable Guild of Judges and Notaries in Florence had a very strict rule, right? They barred illegitimate sons from joining.
Yes. The logic was that a notary had to be a certified witness whose trustworthiness was above reproach, so the guild demanded its members be fully integrated into mainstream society. Being born out of wedlock officially disqualified him from the family path.
But let me push back a little here, because his dad was incredibly rich and connected. He notarized things for the Medici family, right? Couldn't he have just pulled some strings, paid a fee, and gotten Leonardo legally legitimated?
He absolutely could have. There was actually a legal mechanism for this. You could go to a local official known as a Count Palatine, present a petition, and the child could be legitimated. And what's interesting is that Piero didn't have any other children for the first 24 years of Leonardo's life. You would think he'd be desperate for an heir to take over the firm.
So why didn't he do it?
Well, the sources suggest 2 reasons. First, the Notary Guild had a secondary rule that even legitimated out-of-wedlock sons were still denied membership. It was a really strict barrier.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And second, and probably more importantly, Piero likely chose not to force the issue because it became very clear very early on that Leonardo was completely uninterested in legal documents. He vastly preferred drawing, exploring the countryside, and sculpting. Piero probably just decided to hold out hope for a legitimate son from one of his later marriages to take over the business, leaving Leonardo free to be an artist.
Which worked out for everyone. And the cultural historian Jacob Burckhardt famously called this era a golden age for bastards. Among the artists and the ruling classes of Renaissance Italy, illegitimacy wasn't the public scarlet letter, it was in other eras. It actually freed brilliant minds like the writers Boccaccio and Alberti to be highly creative.
It's a fascinating psychological position to be in. When you are illegitimate in a prominent family, you're in a weird societal limbo.
But you're on the edge.
Right. You are part of the family, you eat at the table, but you are not totally of the family. You aren't the heir. You are an insider and an outsider simultaneously. This ambiguity of status forces these young men to be more adventurous. They couldn't rely on inheritance, so they had to hustle. They grew up feeling a part of the world, but also detached enough to observe it critically, which is a perfect recipe for a creative mind.
Okay, so being born out of wedlock didn't just save him from a life of drafting Latin contracts, it fundamentally altered his education. And this directly led to his unique approach to science. Because he wasn't bound for a guild, he wasn't sent to the elite Latin schools.
Right, the Latin schools were where the well-groomed, aspiring professionals of the early Renaissance went to learn the classics, the humanities, and the ancient texts. Leonardo bypassed all of that. Aside from picking up some basic commercial math at what was known as an abacus school, he was almost entirely self-taught.
He embraced it too. He proudly signed his name, Leonardo da Vinci, disciple of experience. But I want to push back on romanticizing this a bit. There's a real danger in looking at history and thinking, see, no school equals genius. Going up against the highly educated, wealthy elite of Florence who could quote Latin poetry and debate ancient philosophy, he must have felt some serious imposter syndrome.
Oh, the imposter syndrome was massive. You can read the defensiveness in his notebooks. He unleashed these aggressive written blasts at the pompous fools who judged him for being what they called an unlettered man.
Yeah, he really went after them.
He mocked them, saying they strutted around puffed up and adorned, not with their own labors, but by simply reciting the words of others. He essentially said, you just write old books. I am out here actually looking at the world.
Which is such a brilliant defense. But it wasn't just a defense mechanism, it was his greatest intellectual asset. He avoided what the sources call dusty scholasticism.
Exactly. Scholasticism was the dominant academic framework of the time. If you went to a Latin school, you were taught to revere the authority of ancient texts above all else. If Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas wrote something about physics or nature, it was accepted as absolute truth. You didn't question it, you just memorized it.
But Leonardo didn't care about that.
Right. Leonardo, having no reverence for that authority, and honestly, not having the Latin fluency to read it anyway, relied entirely on direct observation and his own experiments.
He was utilizing the scientific method decades before Francis Bacon or Galileo were even born. He wrote, "First I shall do some experiments before I proceed further, because my intention is to consult experience first, and then with reasoning show why such experience is bound to operate in such a way." He just looked at the mechanics of nature.
And his observations were incredibly profound because of it. Instead of reading Aristotle's theories on animals, Leonardo would look at the feet of a goose. Yes, a goose. He noticed that if a goose's foot was permanently webbed open or permanently closed, the creature wouldn't be able to generate the propulsion to swim. The mechanics of the webbing opening to push water and closing to move forward with less drag fascinated him. Or he'd look at a fish in a river and a bird in the sky, and he'd wonder, why is the fish so much faster in the water than the bird is in the air, when water is so much heavier and thicker than air?
Wow.
He was instinctively grasping concepts of fluid dynamics, density, and lift just by trusting his eyes.
But reading nature directly meant confronting its terrifying aspects too, not just the logical, mechanical ones. Because he relied so heavily on his own raw experience, Leonardo had to learn to manage some deeply intense, almost overwhelming emotions when nature didn't make sense. And there are a few key memories that highlight this, starting with the cave.
The cave memory is one of the most vivid entries in his notebooks. He recalls hiking among some gloomy, dark rocks near Florence, and he chances upon the mouth of a great cavern. He stood there, peering in, but the darkness was absolute. He wrote that suddenly he was gripped by two contrary emotions, fear and desire. Fear of the threatening dark abyss and a burning desire to see whether there was any marvelous thing hiding inside.
And the desire to know outweighed the fear.
It did. He went in, and what he found embedded in the wall of the cave was astonishing. It was a massive fossilized whale.
Which is an incredible paleontological find, but it completely rattled him, didn't it?
It triggered a profound existential dread. Seeing this mighty, once-living sea creature trapped inside a mountain rock led to a dark vision of an apocalyptic deluge. He began writing feverishly about a time when the rivers would dry up, the earth would burn to a cinder, and all earthly nature would end in fire and ruin.
That's so heavy.
It really shows how his unfiltered curiosity offered up brilliant scientific discoveries, but also left him vulnerable to imaginative, terrifying fantasies.
That blending of intense observation and almost dreamlike fantasy shows up in another famous story from his infancy too, the kite memory. He wrote that he vividly remembered being in his cradle, and a kite, which is a type of hawk with a forked tail, flew down, landed on him, and actually struck the inside of his lips with its tail several times.
Which brings us to the famous 1910 disaster involving Sigmund Freud.
Oh, this is the best part.
Freud decided he was going to psychoanalyze Leonardo, based almost entirely on this specific cradle memory. But Freud relied on a terrible German translation of Leonardo's notebooks. The translator had mistakenly translated the Italian word for kite as vulture.
You can just see the dominoes falling toward a bad theory.
It was a spectacular collapse. Because Freud thought it was a vulture, he went on this wild, tangent-filled explanation about the symbolism of vultures in ancient Egyptian mythology, the etymological relationship of the words for vulture and mother, and ultimately argued that because the word for tail in Italian is slang for the male anatomy, this memory proved Leonardo's repressed desires and fixation on his mother.
I mean, wait, we have to call a timeout here. I want to firmly push back on this tendency to psychoanalyze historical figures using thin data. Isn't it infinitely more likely that a guy who spent his entire life obsessively studying the mechanics of bird flight, who literally wrote treatises on how a kite uses its forked tail to break and land, just had a vivid, weirdly specific, dream-like memory about a bird?
Modern scholars completely agree with you. They have thoroughly devastated Freud's analysis. It really serves as a cautionary tale. When we look at history, we shouldn't force our modern psychological frameworks onto a mind that operated 5 centuries ago, especially based on translation error.
Exactly.
The memory most likely just reflects his lifelong, passionate, almost primal interest in the flight of birds.
So amidst all this intense observation of nature, his daydreaming, and his wandering the hillsides of Vinci, a massive shift happens. At age 12, after his grandfather and his stepmother pass away, Leonardo packs up and moves to Florence with his father. And Florence in the 1460s is not just another city, it is an absolute powerhouse.
It was the center of the known world for art and commerce. The sources cite an essayist from the time who proudly listed the 7 fundamental things that made Florence perfect. It had complete liberty, a large population, wealth, clear, pure water, elegantly dressed citizens, and a university that taught both Greek and accounting.
Greek and accounting, I mean, that combination tells you everything you need to know. It's like moving to Silicon Valley today. Suddenly he's surrounded by people who are just as obsessed with making money and financing projects as they are with high-level philosophy and the humanities.
Exactly, is the perfect mix.
And that environment essentially gave him permission to blend art and engineering. But the transition from a quiet rural town to this booming metropolis wasn't seamless. He recorded a fable in his notebooks that perfectly captures his culture shock. It's the fable of the stone.
It's a deeply poignant metaphor. He writes about a stone of good size that is perched on a quiet, elevated hill, surrounded by a grove of flowers. But the stone looks down at a busy, stony road below and thinks, "What am I doing here with these herbs? I want to live in the company of my fellow stones." So it rolls itself down the hill.
But once it gets to the road, it is a disaster. It's constantly trampled by the iron hooves of horses, run over by heavy cartwheels, and covered in mud and animal dung. It looks back up at the quiet hill it came from, longing for its tranquil peace. But it's too late. It's stuck in the grime.
He was clearly working through his own feelings of homesickness.
It's exactly like a kid from a tiny farm town packing up and moving to a bustling, chaotic metropolis like New York City. On day one, as they're getting shoved on the subway platform and splashed by a speeding taxi, they immediately regret leaving the quiet greenery behind.
Oh, for sure.
But here's the beautiful irony. Despite that initial homesickness, that bustling, messy, elegantly dressed, wealthy city of Florence was exactly the crucible Leonardo needed. If he had stayed on the quiet hill, he would have never found the patrons, the workshops, or the intellectual friction required to become who he became.
And if we synthesize all of this, the chaotic to-do lists, the lack of formal schooling, the relentless observation of nature, the move to Florence, the most important takeaway from Isaacson's biography is that Leonardo's magic was not superhuman processing power. He wasn't a divine recipient of universal knowledge like we sometimes imagine physicists or mathematicians to be. His genius was deeply, profoundly human.
It was rooted in his absolute comfort with being a misfit. He was illegitimate, a vegetarian in a meat-eating culture, left-handed, gay, easily distracted, prone to leaving projects half-finished, and sometimes overwhelmed by dark moods. But he didn't try to force himself into the mold of a traditional notary or a standard scholar. He used his outsider status. He refused to stop asking why.
And that is the most actionable lesson for all of us today. You don't need a supernatural gift to channel a bit of Leonardo's genius. You just need to train yourself to pay a little more attention. Notice how the sunlight hits the drapes in your living room, and how that changes the color of the shadows in the corner. Watch how water swirls when you step in a puddle on the street. Observe how the glint of light on a shiny surface shifts when you tilt your head.
It's about recovering that childhood sense of wonder that most of us just, slowly let go of as we get older and busier. We stop looking at the goose's foot.
Exactly. It's about consulting experience first, engaging with the physical world before accepting the assumptions we've been handed.
Which brings us to one final, wonderfully unresolved mystery from Leonardo's wildly chaotic to-do lists. We talked about the pig lungs, the hot baths, and measuring the sun. But there was another highly specific instruction he wrote to himself in his notebooks. Describe the tongue of the woodpecker.
Which is just classic Leonardo. I mean, who on earth decides, while designing weapons of war and painting masterpieces, that they desperately need to know the anatomy of a woodpecker's tongue? It wouldn't help him paint a portrait. It wouldn't help him build a bridge.
But the source material notes something amazing here. There are actually truly fascinating, mind-bending things to learn about the tongue of the woodpecker. But the book doesn't even tell us what they are. It just leaves it hanging there, a mystery on the page.
Because the specific answer isn't the point. The act of seeking it out is the point. This raises a crucial question for all of us. When was the last time we sought out a piece of knowledge just for the pure, unadulterated joy of knowing it?
So for you listening right now, we have a challenge. Exercise your own personal Leonardo-style curiosity today. Go look at the tongue of the woodpecker, see what he was so eager to discover. Because in the end, whether you're trying to design an armored vehicle, map the flow of a river, or you're just trying to figure out how to put painting at the very bottom of your resume, the secret isn't knowing everything. The secret is simply never losing the desire to know.